Evacuation Day on November 25 marks the day in 1783 when British troops departed from New York Town on Manhattan Island, after the end of the American Revolutionary War. After this British Army evacuation, General George Washington triumphantly led the Continental Army from his former headquarters, north of the city, across the Harlem River south down Manhattan through the town to the Battery at the foot of Broadway. The last shot of the war was reportedly fired on this day, as a British gunner fired a cannon at jeering crowds gathered on the shore of Staten Island, as his ship passed through the Narrows at the mouth of New York Harbor. The shot fell well short of the shore. Background: following the devastating losses at the Battle of Long Island on August 27, 1776, General George Washington and the Continental Army retreated across the East River by benefit of both a retreat and holding action by well-trained Maryland line troops at Gowanus Creek and Canal, and a night fog which obscured the barges and boats evacuating troops to Manhattan Island. Washington's Continentals subsequently withdrew north and west out of the town, and following the Battle of Harlem Heights and later action at the river forts of Fort Washington and Fort Lee on the northwest corner of the island along the Hudson River on November 16, 1776, evacuated Manhattan Island. They headed north for Westchester County and fought delaying action at White Plains. Later Washington was forced west into northern New Jersey and then south into Pennsylvania, taking shelter behind the banks of the upper Delaware River for the rest of the winter. For the remainder of the war for American independence, much of what is now Greater New York and its surroundings in Lower New York State, southwestern Connecticut, and northern New Jersey and northeastern Pennsylvania were under British control. New York City became, under Admiral of the Fleet Richard Howe, Lord Howe, and his brother Sir William Howe, General of the British Army, the British political and military centre of operations in British North America. David Matthews was then the mayor of New York Town during the British occupation, and many of the civilians then continuing to be residing in town were loyalists. The region became central to the development of a Patriot intelligence network, including the spy Nathan Hale. The city suffered a devastating fire of uncertain origin after the evacuation of Washington's Continental Army at the beginning of the British Army occupation. This resulted in the royal forces and prominent loyalists occupying the remaining undamaged structures, relegating the fire-scarred ruins for the rest of the city's residents to live in squalor and under harsh conditions. In addition, over 10,000 Patriot soldiers and sailors died through deliberate neglect on prison ships in New York waters during the British occupation. More Patriots died on these ships than died in every single battle of the war combined. These men are memorialized, and many of their remains are interred at the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument in Fort Greene Park, Brooklyn. Event history: British evacuation from New York in mid-August 1783. So Guy Carleton, then the last British Army and Royal Navy commander in formerly British North America, received orders from his superiors in London for the evacuation of New York Town. He informed the President of the Confederation Congress that he was proceeding with the subsequent withdrawal of refugees, liberated slaves and military personnel as fast as possible. But it was not possible to give an exact date because the number of refugees entering the city recently had increased dramatically. More than 29,000 Loyalists refugees were eventually evacuated from the city. The British also evacuated former slaves they had liberated from the Americans and refused to return them to their American enslavers and overseers, as the provisions of the Treaty of Paris had required them to do. Carleton gave a final evacuation date of 12 noon on November 25, 1783. Following the departure of the British, the city was secured by colonial troops under the command of General Henry Knox. Entry into the city by General George Washington was delayed until after a British flag which had been spotted still flying had been removed. A British Union Jack was nailed on a flagpole in the Battery Park at the southern tip of Manhattan as a final act of defiance, and the pole was allegedly greased. After a number of men attempted to tear down the British colours, wooden cleats were cut and nailed to the pole, and with the help of a ladder, an Army veteran, John Van Arsdale, was able to ascend the pole, remove the flag, and replace it with the Stars and Stripes before the British fleet had completely sailed out of sight. Washington's entry into New York 7 years after the retreat from Manhattan. General George Washington and Governor of New York George Clinton reclaimed Fort Washington on the northwest corner of Manhattan Island and then led the Continental Army in a triumphal precision march down the road through the center of the island onto Broadway and the town to the Battery. Aftermath. Even after Evacuation Day, some British troops still remained in frontier forts in territory that the Treaty of Paris assigned to the United States. Britain would continue to occupy some of these old Northwest forts in the Great Lakes area until 1794 and the signing of Jay's Treaty, and in some cases until 1815, at the end of the War of 1812. A week later, on December 4, at Flounce's Tavern, at Pearl and Broad Streets, after a Turtle Feast banquet, General Washington formally said farewell to his officers with a short statement, taking each one of his officers and official family by the hand. Later, Washington headed south, being cheered and feted on his way at many stops in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. By December 23, he arrived in Annapolis, Maryland, where the Confederation Congress was then meeting at the Maryland State House to consider the terms of the Treaty of Paris. At their session in the old Senate chamber, he made a short statement and offered his sword and the papers of his commission to the president and the delegates, thereby resigning as commander-in-chief. He then retired to his plantation home, Mount Vernon, in Virginia. Commemoration. Early popularity. For over a century this event was commemorated annually, with boys competing to tear down a Union flag from a greased pole in Battery Park, as well as the anniversary in general being celebrated with much adult revelry and corresponding beverages. Decline. The importance of the commemoration was waning in 1844, with the approach of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. The observance of the date was also diminished by the Thanksgiving Day proclamation by 16th President Abraham Lincoln on October 3, 1863. That called on Americans in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of Thanksgiving. That year, Thursday fell on November 26. In later years, Thanksgiving was celebrated on or near the 25th, making Evacuation Day redundant. 1883 Centennial celebration. In the 1890s, the anniversary was celebrated in New York at Battery Park with the raising of the Stars and Stripes by Christopher R. Forbes, the great-grandson of John Van Arsdale, with the assistance of a Civil War Veterans Association from Manhattan, the Andersons Walvis. John Lafayette Riker, the original commander of the Andersons Walvis, was also a grandson of John Van Arsdale. Riker's older brother was the New York genealogist James Riker, who authored Evacuation Day, 1783, for the spectacular 100th anniversary celebrations of 1883, which were ranked as one of the great civic events of the 19th century in New York City. In 1900, Christopher R. Forbes was denied the honor of raising the flag at the Battery on Independence Day and on Evacuation Day, and it appears that neither he nor any veterans organization associated with the Van Arsdale-Riker family or the Andersons-Walvis took part in the ceremony after this time. Following the warming of relations with Britain immediately preceding World War I, the observance all but disappeared. 2008 225th anniversary celebration. Though little celebrated in the previous century, Evacuation Day was commemorated on November 25, 2008, with searchlight displays in New Jersey and New York at key high points. The searchlights are modern commemorations of the bonfires that served as a beacon signal system at many of these same locations during the Revolution. The 7 New Jersey Revolutionary War sites: Beacon Hill in Summit, South Mountain Reservation in South Orange, Fort Nonsense in Morristown, Washington, Rock in Greenbrook, the Navesink Twin Lights, Princeton, and Ramapo Mountain State Forest near Oakland. 5 New York locations contributed to the celebration: Bear Mountain State Park, Storm King State Park, Scenic Hudson's Spy Rock in New Windsor, Washington's headquarters State Historic Site in Newborough, Scenic Hudson's Mount Beacon,